SpaceX tested one of its Falcon 9 rockets around 10 a.m. Pacific time on November 17th and said that its next Starlink launch could happen as soon as Friday, November 18th. However, SpaceX canceled these plans 7 hours later, saying it needed to look more closely at the data collected during the test. So in today's video, we will look into SpaceX's delay after Falcon 9 static fire test. What should you know, and what kind of plans do they have next? Welcome to Smarter Tech for all interesting, trending technology news, most especially SpaceX news. We keep you updated always. And without further ado, let's get started. Before launching its newest batch of 53 Starlink broadband satellites on Sunday, SpaceX tested a Falcon 9 rocket at NASA's Kennedy Space Center on Saturday. Once a standard component of each SpaceX launch campaign, static fire tests on the launch pad are now being phased out for most flights as the Falcon 9 launch frequency has increased to an average of one flight per week. SpaceX brought another Falcon 9 to Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center on Friday in preparation for launch Sunday with an additional 53 internet relay nodes just a few hours after launching a Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, carrying 46 Starlink broadband satellites. The rocket was initially prepared for a static fire test on Saturday morning by SpaceX launch team. Around 35 minutes before ignition time, liquid oxygen and kerosene started to flow into Falcon 9. SpaceX personnel monitored and controlled the procedure in Firing Room 4 of the Launch Control Center at Kennedy. At 9 a.m. on Saturday, the Merlin engines ran for roughly 7 seconds while hydraulic hold-down clamps kept the Falcon 9 securely on the ground. To produce 1.7 million pounds of thrust, the engines were throttled up, briefly ejecting an exhaust plume into the flame trench. After the test firing, SpaceX drained the rocket's propellants and declared that the mission was on hold till further notice. Before we continue, hold up. If you're watching us for the first time, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can enjoy our future videos while getting updated. Getting back to the topic, after a static fire test, this is not the first time SpaceX has put off a launch indefinitely, but it is the first time in years. SpaceX sometimes stops trying to launch to do inspections, minor repairs, or replace parts when data is wrong or contradictory. But those plans usually include following planned launch date. This time, SpaceX's website has been changed to say, once confirmed, a new target launch date will be announced. If you can remember clearly, in August 2019, SpaceX fired up a Falcon 9 rocket before the Amos 17 launch, didn't like what it saw, replaced the valve on the booster, and then did a second static fire test to clear the rocket to launch. This was the last time a pre-launch static fire was directly blamed for a launch delay. Now, the order of events in Starlink 22.4 may be the same. Airspace closures show that Starlink 2.4 had already been late more than once, missing its targets on November 16 to 18. If they clear the delay, the mission will be the 53rd dedicated launch for the Starlink network and SpaceX's 33rd launch of the year. The business broke its previous record of 31 launches in a year set in 2021 with Friday's launch from California, which was the 32nd Falcon 9 launch of 2022. Aside from the static firing of 6 of the 33 Falcon 9 missions that SpaceX has launched this year, a test firing was carried out on the launch pad on Saturday. Prior to each Falcon 9 launch until 2020, SpaceX conducted a pre-launch test firing. After that, the company steadily reduced the use of static firings. At first, a static firing was previously required when an engine was removed from one of SpaceX's reusable Falcon 9 rockets in between missions. According to a study released last month by Aviation Week and Space Technology, this rule has been amended to merely necessitate doing a pre-launch test firing when 3 or more engines are removed between flights. To guarantee engineers found any issues with the rocket before launch day, static firings were initially a feature of every SpaceX launch campaign. But as test firings have decreased in frequency, SpaceX has improved its record regarding launching on schedule. The last time a technical issue aborted a Falcon 9 launch during the terminal countdown was in December 2020. This week's abort in California was the first since then. From December 2020 until this month, SpaceX recorded 62 consecutive launches without having to abort the countdown due to a rocket issue. And since a static fire test explosion in 2016 destroyed a Falcon 9 rocket and the Israeli-owned Amos 6 communication satellite, SpaceX has completed 141 straight successful missions. After the boosters leave SpaceX manufacturing in Hawthorne, California, they continue to be tested on a test stand at the company's site in Central Texas. The Starlink 425 mission's takeoff will add 53 additional Starlink internet satellites into low Earth orbit. Ascended from Pad 39A, the Falcon 9 will fly northeast over the Atlantic Ocean and parallel to the U.S. East Coast. About 2.5 minutes into the mission, the rocket's first stage booster will shut down. Cold gas thrusters and titanium grid fins will help control the Falcon 9's first stage's flight path as it makes its way towards SpaceX drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, which is docked about 400 miles downrange in the Atlantic Ocean. Engine burns will cause the rocket to slow down before a drone ship landing. The Starlink 425 mission's B-1062 booster will launch for the 8th time into space. Launches of the all-private Inspiration 4 and Axiom 1 crew missions followed in September 2021 and April of this year, respectively. It made its debut with the launch of a U.S. military GPS navigation satellite in November 2020. The most recent launch of the booster was on June 8 with the geostationary communications satellite of Egypt Nilesat 301. The upper stage of the Falcon 9 will burn for about 6 minutes to deliver 53 flat-packed Starlink satellites into an orbit with an inclination of 53.2 degrees to an equator, between 144 miles and 210 miles, as the first stage descends toward landing on Sunday. During the second stage burn, the Falcon 9's reusable payload fairing will be ejected. A recovery ship is also stationed in the Atlantic to rescue the 2 nose cone sections once they splash down under parachutes. At T+15 minutes, 24 seconds, the satellites, each weighing more than a quarter of a ton, will detach from the rocket's upper stage. 4 retention rods will be ejected to let the satellites escape Falcon 9 in orbit. The rods keep the spacecraft attached to the rocket during the ascent to space. To get their operational height of 335 miles, the Starlink satellites will spread out their solar panels and employ ion propulsion. Depending on the orbital plane each spacecraft is aiming towards, the orbit-raising maneuvers normally take a few weeks to a few months. Before Sunday's flight, SpaceX had launched 2,904 Starlink satellites, including prototypes and older, non-operational spacecraft designs. The corporation claims that 36 nations currently offer access to its Starlink broadband service. Even though the number of Starlink satellites already working is impressive, Elon Musk has said that the constellation is still losing money. He has also said that a new version of the Starlink satellite, which is set to be launched on the company's new Starship vehicle, is still needed for the service to reach its intended reach and bandwidth. The Starlink system has been helpful during both natural and man-made disasters such as Hurricane Ian in South Florida, wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, and the war in Ukraine. And now recently, guess what? Well, SpaceX asked the Department of Defense for help paying for the constellation services in Ukraine. The company then changed its mind and seemed to have offered to keep paying for the Starlink deployment in Ukraine. And after an unsuccessful attempt to create a darksat using a black coating, the Starlink version 1.0 satellites were later updated to add a sunscreen that lowers the craft's brightness in the sky around sunrise and sunset by around a magnitude. The version 1.5 standard satellites now being launched have laser connectivity for decreased latency between satellites. The Starlink version 2 satellites will have better ways for satellites to talk to each other, more power, and more bandwidth. Now, a new version of the Starlink satellite is being made that will have at least some of these features and will be able to fly on the Falcon 9. However, the number of satellites F9 could carry at once will likely go down. Even though Starlink version 2 will start flying on Starship next year, more Starlink version 1.5 launches are still on SpaceX's list of planned flights. But the workhorse Falcon 9 will finally get a short break. The next SpaceX mission will be the long-delayed USSF-44 flight on Falcon Heavy from Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. Anyway, what do you think of the Falcon 9 static fire test? And will SpaceX ever launch the Starlink? Comment down below. Also, please leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos. Goodbye!